Good morning everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. I just wanted to go through a project I did connected to Anne Brooke's in the UK. This project was called Sew for the Soul, and that is the hashtag that if you wanted to go and have a look at some other videos and some work that others have made, hashtag Sew for the Soul handmade. The videos will all start popping up onto your channel so that you can have a little look. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to zoom in a little bit and show you 4 panels that I made and pop them on a reel, a wooden vintage reel that would have had threads on it in a textile mill, and that's what we sort of created to hold our pieces of embroidery. So I'll just zoom in and go into it, whoops, the other way, go into a little bit more detail so you can see what I did. Okay, so if I pop that there, I might just go in a fraction more, you can see then the piece. Okay, so the project was to create a length of embroidery. Now the width of the piece is just 4 inches, 4¼ inches, so not very wide, so a nice little project. And the piece that I length, you could make any size you wanted. I end up doing, I think, about 36 inches, 30 inches, and create a piece of fabric like calico that is 4 inches by 36 inches or 30 inches, and then embellish it with bits and pieces. I'm going to turn that around because I've just noticed my little bird is upside down. So we're going to start the piece here. So if I turn this over, you'll see that I used a piece of felt. Now in reflection, I probably could have used calico, because this made it quite thick. So when it came to winding it onto the little reel, it was already very thick due to the fact that I'd used this felt. So if that had been calico, I think it probably would have given me a little bit more space. I haven't covered the back yet. You can still see all my stitches because I'm still adding to it. Now some of the ladies put a piece of lace or a piece of printed fabric over the back so that it was completed, and some of them hung them on walls, some of them just folded them up, and a few were using these old reels to store them. Some of the girls had cotton reels, old cotton reels, so they did ones that were half this size and then just wound them onto a cotton reel, and they were only about 12 inches long. So you really can do any size you like, but I had inherited a few of these, so I wanted to do something with them, and like usual, they're sitting in the cupboard. So when I saw this project, I thought, perfect, I can make a inspiration piece. So our challenge was to pick a range of colors and then stitch onto a strip of the fabric textures. So don't overthink it, just keep it within colors. So in this particular one, I did the denim tones, a little touch of green, creams, and went from there. So I started off by putting a fringe on the end. This is a paper image, a stamp with some calico behind it, little timber bird, some Suffolk puffs, yo-yos, buttons, and that pretty much follows the theme of the bits and bobs that I use. I always tend to go for these particular items, and because I used a bird, another bird appeared. So sort of creating the story of these little birds in amongst clusters. So the first thing we did, if you look behind here, you'll see there's squares of fabric. So I went through the whole length and just laid down lots of different squares of fabric, stitched them down. Then I went back to each square and I may have done some embroidery, like some little X's, or left it plain, or did some burrow stitch. So that started decorating the background. Then I went through and embellished. So that's adding all of these bits and bobs, bits of lace, bits of flowers, buttons, created a bow out of some sari silk. Another little stamp, it's a little deer, a bird. And created just a yummy, there's another little bird, yummy collection of random items, which then sort of builds a story. It was amazing how this came together as you sort of started adding more and more. That's some fibre that you would get from knitting when you buy a ball of eyelash yarn. That's what's in there. Some beads, a little timber bird cage. And then we get to the end of the piece, and as it went around the bobbin, I just secured it with some slip stitch in here so that it stayed on, and then all I had to do was just roll it up. So that's the first one, and I'll just roll that up, and that's the piece. Okay, so the next one, because I didn't stop at one, I think the first one was a brown and orange tone, and then the rest sort of followed because I was just hooked, and I had so many scraps. It was a really good way of using them up. This is an edge of a doily, and everything on this one was neutral, so with a little pop of golden yellow, lots of yo-yos, and in amongst it is a twine that once I got my background pieces down, all of the random patches of fabric, and they're all secured with a few little stitches here and there, whether it just be a little feature like that or some X's or some little lines. I then went through the whole piece and stitched on this twine like it was a vine growing along the whole piece. That vine then gave me the ability to create clusters of yo-yos as if they were blossoms along the vine. Does that make sense? So background, then the vine, and then the flowers. And then once I sort of got into flower mode, I had this lace that was lots of these little leaves, and I sort of separated them all and then used them as the leaf on the vine as I slowly built up this floral image twisting along this vine. Lots of beads in clusters. Oops, coming out of the shot a little bit. So I tried to stay very lineal in this particular piece and on the vine itself. This was a lot of fun. And the good thing about this is you don't have a massive area to work in at any one time. So you sit down in front of the TV and you might only embroider just this little bit. That's very achievable. And then the next day you might do the next little bit. So you're sort of building up your piece. If I bring that up and just slowly slide it through, you're building up your piece with beads and buttons. And because you've confined your space and you confined your design and your color range, once you sort of stay within the parameters that you've set, it just comes together, and there's a lot of cohesion in it because you're not jumping around, changing direction. Adding a piece of fabric in the background that has words on it too really changes the element behind the piece. I tried to add some plain calico in there as well. I like a little bit of air, space with nothing in amongst my designs. It sort of allows the eye to slow down a little bit because it's so decorated. Your eye is coming along and looking, and then you see these words, and just to have that up there with nothing just allows the mind sort of to rest for a minute before you then head on the journey to look at the next pieces. So this little piece of crochet come off of a doily, and that's sort of like what was on the end here. And it was very gathered, frilly edge to a doily. So it was perfect as a little element on the end. And once again, I haven't finished the back. I don't think I ever will, because, you know, as I find bits and pieces, there's no reason why I can't pick this up and just stitch something on there. And it'll become a collection of little treasures that when I look at some of these pieces, I will remember maybe a bigger project that maybe some yo-yos were made for. And this has just a couple of them. So this next one, this was the first one I made, I believe. And it was all about mustards and browns. So a great place to put snippets of really old lace too. This lace in particular, this thing would be probably 80 years old, and I only have like a 20 centimetre piece of it. So this was a perfect spot just to pop a little bit of that textile, some old buttons, some old metal buttons. So I'll just wind this one out so you can sort of see. It's not as embellished as the last one, but the last one was all about pearls, so I just went to town. This one is just a little bit more simple, and it's more about the colours, if that makes sense. Oh, here's an old piece of lace. This one appears on a few of my pieces. It's actually a collar from an old blouse. I've mentioned before my grandmother was a seamstress, and because she was sewing in the Depression, every bit of textile she could get her hands on was very valuable. So this would have been on a dress or a blouse from her mother or one of her aunts, and she would not throw anything out. You should have seen her sewing room. It was just full of treasure. She would have removed this lace and kept it for something to be used in the future. And of course she didn't this time, and I got this lace collar, and I'm never going to apply a lace collar to a piece of clothing. So these projects are a really good way of finding a home for such things, and we've all got them, bits and pieces. That there is another old braid that came from a hat that my grandmother's aunt, who was a hat maker, was, well, they all made hats, to be honest, but that cream piece of braid is from the edge of a hat, around the crown of the hat. That one there too, that's a really old lace through the center, and then I added 2 pieces of lace either side as modern pieces, but the one in the center, that's a really old piece as well. That's some lace that I tea-dyed just to get a piece in there that was very floral, and of course it was white, so I just soaked it in some tea. Okay, so that's the mustard one, and we've got one more that I can show you. I'll just wind this back up. Oh, fringing. That's off of a pillar slip. That there was a ruffle on a pillar slip that I found at an op shop. They're great if you get to an op shop and you know when you buy a quilt and there'll be 2 pillow slips in there that are really decorative, beautifully embroidered, textured pillow slips. But to be honest, to sleep on them is a nightmare because you get the textures printed on your cheek in the morning because you've been laying on, you know, different surfaces. So often they're just not used, and they end up eventually, as the quilt breaks down, they end up at the op shop. Then those pillow slips, and when you can find them, they're often full of fabrics and stitching that can be utilized in slow stitch, and they're often not used because they're really crazy to be sleeping on them. So the quilt ends up going into the bin, and these random pillow slips end up at op shops. Keep your eye open for them in the linen section because you can pick up all sorts of treasures from them. So this one's all about dusty pinks and beads, yo-yos, lace, random stitches. Once again, I laid down all of my background fabrics, stayed within the one colour, and then added the embellishments and stitches and clusters. Like this section here I would have done in an evening where I literally started on this edge, started popping yo-yos and beads as I worked across to the top and then dropped back down to the edge, creating the arc. I'm moving it around so much. I hope it's not making you seasick. I'll pop some photos at the end so you can have a closer look as we work through these pieces. So that's the end of that one. And then, like I said before, I just slip stitched the end onto the back so that it's secure on the bobbin. It's an old textile bobbin and a perfect place to store these little pieces. As everyone who is a non-sewer says, what are you going to do with them? My husband was one of them. Nothing. They are just random textiles gathered together with little treasures on them that are either from one of my projects or something I've inherited, and they just sit in my sewing room on a bench as little pockets of inspiration of colour. I might just zoom out so that it's a little bit more obvious what they are. Yeah, so if you're looking for a little project to maybe take on a weekend away, cut yourself a strip of fabric, 4 inches by 20 inches, 25 inches, 30 inches, 35 inches, whatever, doesn't matter. And even if you just do 10 inches and decide that you're loving it and you want more, you can easily cut a second piece of fabric and stitch it into the end, and away you go again. So this could be meters and meters long. It's up to you. So that's the little project that I did with Anne Brooks in the UK, textile artist. Check her out. It's one of the many little projects that she's offered up to us all over the last couple of years to increase our skills with slow stitching and thinking about colours and textures and combinations. And this is a great little quick project that uses up scraps and gets you to think about composition and colour and textiles. Okay, I'll leave it at that, and thank you for joining me. I'll pop some photos at the end of this video so you can have a closer look at some of the different layers that I used. Thank you. Bye bye.